What I wanted to spend just the next few minutes talking about is the democratic role of civil society organisations. I'm echoing civil society organisations broadly. So I'm including obviously charities, but the many other forms of civil society organisations that we know about. Fundamentally, democratic participation, I think, is both a means towards and a feature of more equal societies, and civil society organisations are critical in ensuring that those voices that wouldn't otherwise be heard in political processes are in fact included. I'm just about to finish some PhD research on these themes, which I'm getting ready to submit in the next few days. And what I do in that research is I develop a framework for measuring the democratic contribution of these organisations. And I think there are three broad roles that civil society organisations play in terms of democracy. So the first is that they can actually strengthen the institutions of democracy, facilitating stronger and more inclusive representative democracy in parallel to the participative stuff that they do. They do that either by directly critiquing current democratic systems or indeed by offering a vision for how democracy might be more inclusive. The second thing is that they offer citizens opportunities for deliberation and participation in democratic practice. And thirdly, they engage directly in influencing democratic decision-making by contributing to informed and more inclusive decision-making. And that's the broad area that we describe as advocacy, lobbying, campaigning. So that represents a core element of the work. And so while not all organisations will fulfil these roles, and indeed even those who seek to won't always be a positive democratic force, indeed, there's quite a considerable literature out there which talks about the negative impact that civil society organisations can have on democracy. And they tend to revolve around two big claims, if you will. The first is that CSOs may well serve to undermine representative democratic process. And the second is that rather than challenge and take on existing inequalities, that in fact they'll serve to reinforce dominant power narratives and existing inequalities. And while I think those are things, obviously, as a sector, we need to remain very vigilant to, the sector itself, as well as the state and the broader public, have a role in monitoring those and in making sure that the contribution to democracy is in fact positive. Now, I think in Ireland, as elsewhere, policymakers themselves sometimes do question the legitimacy of civil society organisations in engaging with political processes. They do that particularly when they perceive there to be a weakness in the membership base of those organisations, or if they're concerned that there isn't a strong enough link to service provision. And as we know, sometimes that distrust will go even further and it will question the principle of civil society engagement in political processes and not just the legitimacy of individual organisations. And certainly while those views do exist, they're not generally stated explicitly. It's far more common that a policy may be silent about the democratic role of the sector, and we see that we see that how that can happen. Now, I think in Ireland we have a context where the democratic role is recognised, and Clodagh mentioned the white paper, and that's obviously a key. I have a suspicion my microphone's a little bit too close, is it, or it's okay? And so, you know, so there are explicit ways in which the democratic role is recognised, but one I want to suggest and feed into this discussion about a future strategy is that maybe that role isn't recognised as comprehensively as it could be. I looked at a whole sway of different types of policy documents since from the white paper on over the years, and I think overall that third function of contributing to democratic decision making is generally well recognised. About half of them name that as a function of the sector. There's also quite a good degree of space for the role of the sector in facilitating participation and deliberation. Where there perhaps isn't as much emphasis is the role of the sector in engaging in the type of democracy that we all operate in more comprehensively. So that's something that I think you can certainly describe as patchier. So there is, to some extent, a kind of an underlying, I think, ambivalence about the democratic roles of civil society organisations at times. And I think that possibly points to the need for a more comprehensive policy statement about those roles. And I think that framework could set out both the democratic value of civil society organisations, but also potentially describe a democracy-enhancing funding regime. And it's the funding of those roles that's of particular interest to me, and I think is often where the tension points emerge, if you will. But no matter how progressive any state's vision of the democratic role of civil society organisations might be, there will always be tensions. And inevitably, in unequal societies, there's going to be clash points between the sector and the state, and that's not a bad thing. And different organisations will have very different ways of engaging with the state, and they will, and these things can be quite complementary. And indeed, I think the health of civil society depends on having that wide variety of different types of actors. So what I want to conclude with this afternoon is I want to suggest that maybe it's helpful to think about our sector as a democratic ecosystem, and that it's by all the various different elements of that ecosystem interacting and working together that we can perhaps more comprehensively realise that breadth of democratic contribution that these organisations make.